Hello, Professor. For my current topic presentation, I will be overviewing contemporary slavery in our world today. So there are various different definitions of contemporary slavery, but overall it's understood as modern day slavery, or the transporting of victims under false pretenses from one nation or province to another, where they are subjugated to a broad range of practices characterized by the forced nature of different types of exploitation. Although contemporary slavery can take on many forms, the six main forms are human trafficking, which is the use of violence or threats to transport, recruit, or harbor people in order for exploitation; forced labor, or any work or services people are forced to do against their will under threat of punishment; bonded labor, the world's most widespread form of slavery, which is when people trapped in poverty borrow money and are forced to work to pay off the debt, losing control over both their employment conditions and the debt itself. Child slavery is when children are exploited for someone else's gain. This can include child trafficking, child soldiers, child marriage, and child domestic slavery. Forced and early marriage is when someone is married against their will and cannot leave. And descent-based slavery is considered, quote unquote, the most traditional form of slavery, which is when people are treated as property and their slave status is passed down through lineage. So this is a snapshot of the IOL's 2017 global estimates on modern slavery. There were around 40.3 million people in modern slavery, with around 25 million people trapped in forced labor, 16 million people exploited in the private sector, around 5 million people in forced into sexual exploitation, and 4 million people forced into labor imposed by state authorities. Women and girls are also disproportionately affected. Out of 40.3 million people, 71% are women and girls. And each year, human trafficking generates an estimated $150 billion in illicit profits. On a global scale, contemporary slavery is disproportionately prevalent in certain nations and regions over others. India, China, and Pakistan are noted to have the highest number of slaves, while North Korea, Eritrea, and Burundi are known to have the highest prevalence of slavery. And according to the Walk Free Foundation's Vulnerability to Slavery Index, the Central African Republic, South Sudan, and Afghanistan are the most vulnerable to forms of contemporary slavery. These are some global implementations that have been instrumental in mitigating slavery on the international scale, starting with the 1926 Slavery Convention all the way to 2014's IOL's Forced Labor Convention. As we can see, there have been various conventions to address issues of forced labor, women, and children. But despite these efforts thus far, there is still a lot of work to be done. Contemporary slavery is very complex. There are a lot of root causes that create conducive environments for contemporary forms of slavery, such as corruption, poverty, unemployment, inequality, and weak accountability from the law. The UNDP argues that corruption is the main underlying cause and proliferation of this. In general, it can be very difficult to mitigate these issues on a global scale because it involves various nations and there are many differences, like how developed they are, their socioeconomic and political scopes of influence, sociocultural norms and values, and their government. It can also be very difficult to address corruption due to the lack of resources, political inconvenience, the lack of understanding, judicial and legal corruption, a victim's unwillingness to testify, and an overall sense of not knowing what to do or where to go, like knowledge gaps. Thus, in order to address contemporary slavery in an integrated and comprehensive manner, there needs to be continual collaboration and partnership between international organizations, governments, civil societies, and the private sector. There are a lot of international organizations that are already involved, as listed to the right, as well as individual nations, governments, police forces, and NGOs that have already taken steps. But as the UNDP points out, corruption in any of these involved institutions immediately relinquishes any accountability and harms victims and continues to perpetuate forms of contemporary slavery. Based on this and with the partnership between the four main institutions. Recommendations from the UNDP include: one, developing a global monitoring system of corruption in contemporary forms of slavery. Two, having international organizations incorporate the role of corruption and corrupt actors as a key component in their periodic reports, so as to push for an integrated approach to anti-slavery and anti-corruption efforts. Three, having governments on the national level strengthen and centralize their data collection. Four, integrating gender dimensions as a key component in the interaction between corruption and forms of contemporary slavery. This can be done with the help of NGOs. And finally, assessing the gaps in anti-slavery policies and strategies specific to forced marriage and forced domestic labor, as well as incorporating a gender perspective in national strategies aimed to reduce the demand for female modern slaves and on preventing and combating corruption. There is also the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which is a plan of actions to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. 193 states globally have already committed to this, so we'll have to wait and see how effective these strategies are. In conclusion, slavery is still very much an issue in the 21st century. Globalization has perpetuated a lot of this, but I think the interconnectedness and interdependence that comes from globalization can also help in the collaborative and intersectional efforts between organizations, governments, NGOs, and the private sector in eliminating contemporary slavery in the future. Thank you very much. These are my references.